Today's meeting. City Manager, can you continue, please?
Yes, Mayor Pro Tem, thank you. Just a couple of things that I'd like to mention about the presentation today. The entirety of the presentation, which is 60-some slides, will appear on the city's website and be accessible to the public. And of course, they can be printed from the website if people want to do that. And another comment with respect to the length of the presentation. We have repeated some information, some slides from previous workshops and presentations, and the purpose for that is to make a more complete presentation that has background. So instead of just bringing up topics, we've also provided some background from which information or specific information was derived. So hopefully, as a freestanding reference document, it'll make more sense than being about half the length, but with having very little background. Guiding the city's budget process every year are strategic goals. They are the framework for conducting the business of the city and planning the community's future as well. We've seen these goals many times. They're in our budget books and documents, and when we deal with issues and there are trade-offs, then sometimes those trade-offs involve the strategic goals and the extent to which we're capable of achieving them. With respect to the purpose of the workshop today, it is a presentation intended to be a high-level introduction to the funding challenges that must be addressed in order to arrive at a balanced budget for fiscal year 16. What we'd like to see, of course, it's the council's prerogative to conduct this workshop and make your comments and requests as you see fit. From the staff side, we'd like to see, as an outcome, a list of specific topics and questions for more in-depth discussion at the next workshop, which we've scheduled in March, as the budget process proceeds. Additionally, hopefully this will provide an opportunity for public education and raise awareness of municipal finance, which is ever more challenging in this and many other states. This slide is repeated from previous presentations, but it's useful because in any discussion of budgets, there are usually questions about how the city is organized with respect to our funds, and we have two primary types, the governmental funds and proprietary funds. In terms of the governmental funds, the general fund is the primary operating fund of the city, and then we have special revenue funds which are legally restricted by purpose. An example of a special revenue fund would be the 1 cent sales tax for streets and open space. We can only use the revenue in that fund for certain purposes. And so, many people in public don't understand the restrictions which apply to the various types and specific funds. So we receive comments about if you'd only use this money that we're charging for water for police services, then it would sure help out. But that's not the way it works. The framework is pretty strict, actually, in terms of governmental funds and proprietary funds. They're separately accounted, and throughout our budget process and throughout our budget itself, the way we receive and expend money, we observe this particular framework. At this very early stage, comparing to last year, our two main budget workshops, as they have been or were and have been in previous years, were in May. But this is the middle of February, so we are proposing to have, as I mentioned at the outset, several more budget workshops to provide an opportunity for council input, discussion, and so forth, so that by the time we get to what have been the May series of budget workshops and then the formal workshops and public hearings, and decision points in June, we will have a much better idea on a variety of topics, the bottom line, of course, of which is also to, in the general fund, balance the general fund when we're looking at that $1 to $2 million challenge. So our primary focus today is on two funds. That doesn't mean that in our enterprise funds, such as water and wastewater, solid waste, and so forth, it doesn't mean that we will not be going through those in detail with the council. It just means that at this point, at the outset of this process, our challenges really are in two places: the general fund and the streets fund. Unlike enterprise funds, for the majority of general fund expenditures, and 71% of those expenditures in the general fund budget of around $34 million, they're for public safety. As the finance director pointed out on February 3rd, there is no direct correlation between the services provided in the general fund and the revenue. Or the city does not, and as a matter of law, cannot charge for public safety services. So if we respond to an accident and the cost of response is $5,000, we don't send a bill to anyone. How many accidents are we going to have in a year? How many responses are we going to have in public safety? How many fires? How many EMS calls and things like that? We don't get to charge for them. So it's not like you have one trash can or one recycling bin and, it's very specific. There's a correlation. It's quite the opposite.
City Manager, just so it's publicly acknowledged, is there state statutes that govern our opportunity to charge for services that private sector can?
Well, there are indeed. And we'll talk, Councilman, in a little bit here about the city's revenue structure, which makes it quite clear where the money from the general fund comes from, and the fact that there are only very few sources of money. They do not include being able to charge, because that is precluded by law. The other fund that we'd like to focus on today is the streets fund. After operations and maintenance, and of course they involve personnel equipment, after those are accomplished and paid for, the most important use of funding in the streets fund is management of the condition of our streets through preservation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. As we know, the present 1-cent sales tax is decreasing on January 1st of 2016 to 3/4 of a cent. And we have presented and will present again today information which certainly leads to a reasonable conclusion that at 3/4 of a cent, that will be insufficient to maintain the condition of our street assets. We will face growing deterioration and escalating reconstruction costs. I think it would be very useful to very briefly repeat some of the realities of our revenue structure. Whether we like them or not, this is the revenue structure. This is what we have to deal with as an Arizona municipality. We're heavily reliant on sales tax. That's not the case across this nation. If you come from back east and you ever owned a house, you know what the property tax is back there. I'm not suggesting that model. I'm saying it's different. It's a different way of funding municipal services. We in Arizona are heavily reliant on sales tax, whether we like it or not. Since we are reliant on sales tax, we're very interested in revenue enhancement through growth and tourism development, although growth is accompanied by costs of service. And as we know, growth, particularly in this region, will be capped by such things as water availability. Our permitted capacity to generate additional revenue from property taxes limited by state law. So,
can we just go over that one more time?
yes, sir. Maybe you could restate that a different way.
Yeah, with regards to water availability as a limiting factor, with regards to Prescott being able to produce housing. On the other hand, we still have to deal with other areas that are not subject to the same state and federal standards of growth that we are limited to by our resource of water, natural resource of water. I think it's important for the community to understand whether they live in Prescott Valley, Chino Valley, unincorporated areas of the county, they're using the streets of the city of Prescott either for employment or for other purpose, and we, the taxpayer of the city of Prescott, are the ones that are culpable to make sure those roads are in a safe, navigable condition. And yet the people that are growing differently than the city of Prescott is restricted to are the same people that are using the roads, creating the costs, and we have no way to recoup that.
With respect to property tax, let's look at the general fund. The general fund budget's about $34 million per year. And again, as I mentioned, we'll have a breakdown of that in a little bit here. But of that $34 million, only about 4% of that, or $1.6 million, is from property tax, primary and secondary property tax. Very low percentage. And in terms of annually, what capacity, according to Arizona state law, the city has to increase that property tax, if necessary and if accomplished, it's only $30,000. So $34 million budget, 4% of that is from property tax. The revenue is from property tax. And if you want to increase that property tax, the additional tax capacity is only $30,000. That is very significant. One last point is that going back about 3 years ago, when we initiated a series of analyses and workshops on all of our city departments and funds, we decided to do a case study on high-tech development. Many people believe that high-tech development is the magic wand, that if we just had some high-tech employers move in here, that things would be dramatically different. And we showed you then, and I will repeat today, that although that would be very desirable, it is not a magic wand. And I'll show you in a moment here why that's the case. So a couple years ago, we did this analysis, an example of a $25 million capital investment for a high-tech manufacturing facility, creating 300 new high-paying jobs, $75,000 average. We would love to have a development like this. But as we know, most of the products are manufactured, distributed, and sold outside the city, so no sales tax. So for sales tax reliant, big question mark right there. We ran it through some models and so forth, and here's what the result is. That the net for that very desirable high-tech development was about $50,000 worth of revenue for the general fund. Now, in comparison, a convenience store generates about a one-time revenue of $26,000, annual revenue of $17,000 to the general fund because they sell stuff. Okay, the conclusion here is not we need more convenience stores, but this is just to give an idea of scale. So for all those jobs and that $25 million capital investment, the net positive revenue to the general fund is $50,000. That is not going to make a dent in our fiscal year 15 general fund budget of $33.8 million.
But isn't the general idea to have the convenience store outside the high-tech employment?
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah. Prescott, the city of Prescott operates. We live in an economic environment. We are affected by actions and inaction by regionally and also at higher levels of government. Regional competition, revenue dilution. We all know that there's been quite a bit of retail added in neighboring Prescott Valley in recent years. Prescott Valley has grown. Those corporations who have built those boxes out there have looked at that market and decided that it was sufficient, or it becomes sufficient, to put their box in there. Some of those boxes are duplications, the Walmarts. Some of those are other corporations, other retail establishments that we don't have. They've made their business decision. The point is that our retail sales tax collection has been flattening because of that regional competition. In the state of Arizona, we've experienced what's been called transaction privilege tax simplification legislation, which is having a revenue reduction effect on the city of Prescott, which is notable. There are bills before the legislature that you heard about on February 3rd at the mid-year budget update, that there are bills in the legislature which would constitute additional raids on municipal revenues, Prescott included. And of course, we have ever-escalating pension costs over which we really have no control. Nationally, we are affected by federal mandates. The Affordable Care Act is one, for example. We've had to buy $200,000 software program. We'll have licensing fees for that. We have a person who's going to be doing nothing but paying attention to the very stringent requirements of the Affordable Care Act. There will be other operational expenses, and additional health insurance expenses into the future. We're going to try to quantify that.
Could you go over again publicly so people hear, if we don't comply with the Affordable Care Act, the amount of money we had to spend to try and protect the citizens of Prescott, what is the liability for the city if we're not in compliance?
Well, the Affordable Care Act, I think the Human Resources Director informed the council some weeks back when you were considering purchasing the software package to enable us to be compliant, that the federal government, our own federal government, had budgeted about and expects to collect about $17 billion from governments across this country for lack of compliance or violations. The way that would work for the city of Prescott is if the city of Prescott was bound by that law, Affordable Care Act, to provide health insurance, and we did not provide health insurance for one individual. We denied through mistake, oversight, whatever the reason. No excuses, no please forgive me, none of that. You either did or you didn't. It would be $2,000 fine multiplied by 500 employees. That fine is assessed on the number of employees, which leads to a fine for one instance of $1 million. So that's how you get to a $17 billion expected revenue of the federal government for enforcing the Affordable Care Act.
Thank you for that explanation.
Missed one other bullet point, the last one, and this is important. In addition to regional retail competition, we have internet not fairness but unfairness. That is, we continue to lose local sales tax revenue from growing untaxed internet sales, and that's draining municipal funding. And as we know in the general fund, that municipal funding is to support core public safety services. So until the federal government does something about internet unfairness and makes it fair and causes the collection or replacement of these sales taxes which have been lost, we're going to continue to have our revenues drained. We have a dilemma, and that dilemma is the public safety personnel retirement system, not only for Prescott and the other cities and counties in the state. And to be clear, every time we discuss this topic, it's not about the individuals who chose public safety as a career. It's about the pension system that we have to pay for and the funding or underfunding of that pension system. The city of Prescott did not create this pension system, but we are a member. This is a defined benefit program, which means that benefits are based on a formula. It's not a defined contribution system, which reflects how much was put in. It's a defined benefit, which means how much we have to pay. From fiscal year 08 through 15, the current fiscal year, for the city of Prescott, our employer contributions increased from $1.8 million to $4.4 million. Okay, if we think about our general fund budget of $34 million, the increases have been to, $4.4 million for a net increase amount of about $2.6 million. If we project that a couple years into the future, considering what's in the table here, the only reasonable conclusion you can make is that we're going to see increases which are not only equal to that, but probably much more than that. And so, if we're here 5 years from now and looking back at the last 5 years, we're going to see that the public safety personnel retirement system, and our contributions have increased yet more millions. It's inevitable.
Is most of that statutorily guided by state statutes?
Well, there's a framework for and I'm not an expert on the public safety personnel retirement system, but yes, there's a framework there which sets up this system, prescribes how it operates, how it works, who has to pay money, how the benefits are, and so forth. And of course, there are some adjustments now, annual adjustments, which have been I guess, confirmed or imposed, depending upon your viewpoint. And so, the state says, here's the way it works, and what we have to do is contribute the money.
I guess my point there was, Mr. Manager, was to explain to the public, a statute is a law. And each one of us sitting up here agreed to obey laws. And everybody who takes an oath of office to the city of Prescott also agreed to obey those laws. So I'm just making that point.
Right.
City Manager, I just wanted to add too, I think it's very kind that you have it from fiscal year 8 to fiscal year 15, an increase of $2.5 million. But recently I've been shocked by the escalation, because I think about $2 million of that increase has come over the past 3 years.
It's been accelerating, Mayor Pro Tem. So if you look at this table, the retirement liability, this is for the city of Prescott, for police and fire, it's almost $100 million. Okay, that's what we're looking at as far as the sticker price of paying for future benefits for retirees. Those who are in the pension business tend to fund liabilities at the 70 to 80% level. That's considered healthy. You don't fund it at 100% level. If that retirement liability was funded at the 75% level, that would mean $74 million worth of funding would be necessary to support that liability. Third column, our current funding level is about, of that 74 compared to that, is about 28.7 million. A lot of difference there, which means that our shortfall, even at 75% funding, is about 45.6 funding. So 45.6 million. So whose fault is that? Well, it's not the city's fault. We're a member of this particular program. This program is separately accounted. That is, we don't contribute to the pensions of police officers in Tucson. It's separately accounted. We're responsible for our own retirees and that retirement liability. We contribute what PSPRS tells us to. And so we have an obligation. It's a state system. It has its rules. We didn't come up with it. It's not our fault, but this is where, this is the dilemma we have. As the Mayor Pro Tem indicated, the cost of this is accelerating, and we've got a fairly static revenue source in the city of Prescott for a general fund, and the question is, how do you close that gap, which is only going to get bigger? One thing we wanted to do this year is provide to the council and the public some comparisons to other cities. And this is a table of property and sales tax for selected communities, including Prescott. I won't go over it, but from this information, we can draw some observations, if not conclusions. And we pulled a few out of that table. Flagstaff, Lake Havasu, Maricopa were in there, and Sierra Vista's in there. This is a comparison of cities which operate police and fire departments. What we're finding, and having contacted all of these cities recently, basically most of them, if not all, are exploring sales tax increases. At least 2 of them are exploring other funding options to address their public safety costs. And one of these cities is frankly struggling, in their own words, to implement the results of a recent class and compensation study without new funding sources. And as you know, we've got one of those that we're going to be seeing some information from for the first time coming in March.
Can you tell us what other funding sources they're looking at?
They haven't said.
Okay.
So some additional observations from this information, the survey, if you will, of comparison of property and sales tax. In Prescott, we have a sales tax rate of 2%. One of that 1% goes to general fund, the other 1% to the streets and open space fund. That's about 11% less than the average for comparable cities and towns that also operate a fire department. But perhaps of more interest and importance is that for the portion of sales tax of these other cities, municipalities, for the portion of sales taxes that are undedicated, that is, they're available for general fund support, our 1% tax rate is about half that for the 4 comparison cities. So we're running the general fund on 1 cent of sales tax. These other 4 other comparison cities are running theirs on about twice that. So that's something to kind of write down and think about a little bit. As we've said, sales tax continues to be the most crucial revenue for general fund operations. Primary property tax, we're low, and there's not a lot we can do about it. If we're engaged in a discussion about budgets and budget challenges and revenues and expenditures and the difficulties of all that, reasonable people ask inevitably, well, okay, but what have you done? What have you done to become leaner and more effective, more efficient? What have you done in terms of user fees, entrepreneurial initiatives, public-private partnerships? Have you reduced personnel? Have you cut back programs that may not have been necessary? And the next 3 slides are a listing of exactly what we've done since fiscal year 08. And there are a lot of items on here, and you see a lot of zeros. Again, all this information will be on the website for anyone who wants to take a much more detailed look at it. And it goes on and on. But, at the end, we're seeing additional health insurance costs, and we're seeing additional public safety personnel retirement costs. And so that's really what's driving the most immediate issue in fiscal year 16. You've seen, council has seen this slide before about how our employee population has varied with time, and at the height of things in fiscal year 2008, we're about 574 employees. We're now down to 506. So we have substantially reduced positions. So now we're going to get into some numbers, and again, this is background information to set the stage for more detailed discussions and any comments from the council as we go forward into our upcoming workshops. As we've said, the funding structure in our general fund is severely limited by state law. We're subject to continued attacks on sources and revenue by the legislature. They just don't understand, frankly, what it means to run a city and provide full services. 85% of the general fund revenue comes from city and state assessed taxes, which have no correlation to public service demand. 71% of fiscal year 15 general fund expenses are for public safety. That's up from 69% in 14. And 80% of the costs for public safety are for personnel. So our costs in the general fund are personnel driven, public safety and personnel driven.
I think it's important to point out that we have done a comp study in that our personnel sometimes work in Prescott out of choice, not necessarily out of money. There's opportunities elsewhere where our people could earn more money, and they choose to serve the residents of Prescott. You know, it sounds terrible to say that 80% of our cost is because of our personnel, but the truth of the matter is, in relativity, as compared to other communities, our people are doing a great job for not as much money as they could be getting doing the same job somewhere different. And that's part of the attrition that we've been suffering here. And we've been losing people, whether it be in public safety or whether it be in general services that the public demands. The citizens of Prescott pay a lot of money to train people to be experts. And then in a free market system, we can't put handcuffs on them. And I appreciate the ones that choose to stay here.
We do have great employees. We are in the business of providing services. In order to provide services, you need personnel. We provide very high quality services in the city of Prescott, which are personnel oriented. Many other places, you don't find that. You want something, you call and use your touch-tone phone, and you might get a response. Here, you walk in, somebody talks to you, we provide a service, so on and so forth. That high level of service is personnel intensive and does come with a cost. And ultimately, it becomes a question, like we've said, every year in the budget process, what services should the city provide and at what levels of service, and that really determines in large part, and certainly for the general fund, the budget. The growing cost of public safety is continuing to directly pressure other city program services and available resources relied upon to sustain our community's quality of life, and we've got the pie chart here coming up to show you what those other pressured programs and services are. These next two slides were presented at the mid-year budget update, and basically this is where the $1 to $2 million of potential shortfall comes from. These particular items projected and potential items in the legislature as we speak. This particular chart is just for reference how our general fund budgets have varied over the years, and you can see the recession in there. This is a very familiar but very useful and informative chart which shows the relative magnitude of our revenues. And taxes is that kind of blue-purple, and then the red is intergovernmental revenue from the state of Arizona. That is money they send back to us from the state income tax we pay, fees we pay, and so forth. The takeaway from this particular chart is that about half of our revenue is from taxes the city in the general fund, the taxes the city assesses. The other half is from state shared revenue, and the other sources of revenue are relatively minor, including that property tax I mentioned, which is only about 4%. So people know this is a comparison of local sales tax rates. We're at 2% local assessed sales tax, and as I mentioned, 1% of that is for the general fund. The other 1% of that amount is for streets and open space. That compares to 2.33 at Prescott Valley, and on the reservation, 1.5. This is a breakdown. When you pay 8.35% of sales tax in the city of Prescott, 1% general fund, 1% streets and open space. Yavapai County assesses 0.75 for excise and jail taxes. State of Arizona, the majority, 5.6%.
Are you done?
We're getting there.
Let me leave again. Thanks, sir.
And we talked about property tax. This is just some background information here. We've shown you this slide many times because it actually is very informative, this and the following breakdown. For a $200,000 or a home assessed at $200,000 in the city of Prescott, what is the amount of city assessed property tax, primary and secondary? And that's for fiscal year 15, $63. Not a lot of money, $5 a month. If that house is outside the city limits, that property owner outside the city limits pays $524 basically for fire protection. In the city of Prescott, you don't get a separate bill for fire protection. That public safety service is provided from the general fund, the two primary revenue sources of which, as I mentioned, in about equal halves, being our 1% sales tax and state shared revenue.
Is there a way to draw a distinction between what fire service might cost in the city per residential structure?
A cost of service?
Right.
That could be calculated, sure. And it'd be a pretty simple calculation if you look at the amount of, well, you'd have to break it down into different categories, commercial, residential, and so forth. And yeah, that calculation could be done.
I suppose the calculation I would like to see is Central Yavapai people are paying $524.10. I like to compare what the citizens in Prescott are paying for the same service.
Well, they're paying $62, $62,
Okay.
which is actually, for all the property tax. But then you have sales tax too, so it's a different way of funding it. But maybe this will be a little more instructive, that if you get a property tax bill on your $200,000 residence in the city of Prescott, you pay $63 of property tax. Yavapai County, $389, Prescott Unified School District, $423, Yavapai Community College, $417. Now, you haven't seen this before. We haven't presented this one publicly before, but we thought it'd be interesting. Well, and assessed value for a commercial enterprise or property of $200,000 is not very big, but the total tax bill for residential, $200,000 assessed, is $1,500. The total tax bill for commercial, same assessed value, is $2,800. So, someone who owns commercial property may not be very happy that they're paying double residential. That's the way the system is set up. I think that probably when you look at that, the real question is the system in balance or not in balance? And I would submit that of the primary property tax levied on the $200,000 home in Prescott, only 4% of it goes to the city, which provides the most direct services to the majority of the population. So you've got the school district, Yavapai College, and Yavapai County assessing and collecting the lion's share of property tax, residential and commercial, but it is the city of Prescott, which is only getting 4% of that property tax revenue, which provides arguably the most direct services to the majority of the population. That's important. to me, that means the tax system's out of balance, but what else is new? A lot of things are out of balance. Conversely, if you're a commercial property owner, you might wonder why you're paying all this money to the college and the school district when you don't have anybody going to college and you don't have any students, among your workforce. But that's just the way the system's set up. It's the way government has been funded, and that's just the way it is. But the bottom line suggestion is that it's out of balance as it relates to the city of Prescott, because we're providing the most direct services to the majority of the population, but getting almost no tax money to do that. In terms of competition for resources, and there is competition, we only have so many dollars in the general fund. It's about $33.8 or $34 million. As we mentioned before, fiscal year 15, 71% of the general fund expenditures are for public safety. That's just what they are. It's not that that's good, bad, or indifferent. That's what the numbers are. So if there's a tension in the general fund, competition for services, the cost of pensions are going up, whatever the case, you have to look at the other activities and departments in the general fund, because that's where the pressure is going to be exerted as well. Recreation services, quality of life; library, quality of life; development services. We do expend some general fund money, some general fund revenue for the purpose of providing development administration. We have a counter. We recover much of the expense of that, but not all the expense of that, through building permits. We have commissions and committees. We have to staff the Planning Commission. We have historic preservation. We staff that and so forth. Those all represent administrative costs. We operate a parking garage. We have the rodeo grounds. We have the general governmental function of the administrative position it takes to deal with all the revenue and expenses and run the city. And a very small part of that's economic enterprises. So, again, if public safety increases and we have very flat revenue coming in, what gives? And it's got to be, typically, and it has been, because a lot of these costs are mandated, like the pension system, we have to come up with the money. It's in these other smaller wedges of the pie.
What portion, 1% generates how much revenue in 1 year?
About 13, 14 million.
Thank you.
Why does the rodeo and parking garage item show 0%?
Well, it's 0.00 something. It's minimal.
All these numbers are rounded.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And these are the numbers from which the pie chart is constructed. Now, another reasonable question aside, in the series of reasonable questions, at least they're reasonable in my mind. Okay, you got budget challenges. What have you been doing about it? We showed you 3 pages of what we've been doing about that. Well, why don't you just attract high tech? We talked a little bit about that. How about reserves? Does the city have reserves, and what are those reserves? And so what does that mean if you have a particular year in which you have very specific budget challenges? You've got to close a gap. Well, here are the reserves. We have in the general fund a 10% reserve for unanticipated expenditures and revenue shortfalls. If we had a 0% reserve, that would not be financially prudent. We would not know where the money's going to come from if we lost a lawsuit, something catastrophic happened, a lightning bolt hit City Hall, or burnt down, a building or something like that. We'd have no way of dealing with it. So we have a 10% reserve for unanticipated expenditures and revenue shortfalls. What if the money doesn't come in like projected from the state and like projected from our sales tax, even though we do that very conservatively? We have a 10% reserve for operating the business of the city, cash flow, timing differences between when we receive money and when we have to pay money, and that varies quite a bit. So we have to have some means of being able to manage that cash flow. We have reserves for internal loans, the most notable of which is for the golf course. And that's in the fiscal year 15 budget, about $4.2 million is the accumulated operating deficit of the golf course. If the council wanted to take that off the balance sheet, we could zero that out, but that doesn't mean that we would have $4 million to spend. It would just be gone. It would just be taken off of the sheet. The bottom line
And
is,
if you leave it on the sheet, is that an anticipated collection at some point in the future?
that's a matter of council policy, strictly.
Hey, thank you.
The next to the bottom line, or next to the last line on this particular sheet about reserves, is the unassigned reserve available for one-time capital projects. This is not recurring money. This is an amount of money. If you spend it, it's gone. And it's about $6.7 million in the fiscal year 15 budget. Current year budget, we anticipate that it's going to be less than half of that in the upcoming budget. And so, to give you an example, when the city did the Trader Joe's project, we put up $2 million, tied up $2 million worth of capital, which has since been refunded. And of course, there is some earnings on that $2 million. But that $2 million was taken from and then put back into this particular line, the unassigned reserve. And it's one-time money. Again, if public safety pensions growing at $500,000 a year or so forth, that's $500,000 this year and $500,000 next year and $500,000 next year. After 3 years, $1.5 million, which keeps going on forever, theoretically. And so one-time money is not going to solve that recurring liability. Now, this is a new slide. There's been some discussion of next level special enforcement, police enforcement, adding a special or restoring a special enforcement unit within the police department, particularly focused on illegal drug sales and use. And this information comes from the police department. The question was asked, in order to implement a next level illegal drug enforcement unit, what would you recommend? And the recommendation would be that it's a unit consisting of 1 sergeant and 4 detectives. The cost of that, and we don't have this was responding to a question about increasing or enhancing our enforcement, about $180,000 to initially outfit, and then an annual operating cost, including personnel, of about $500,000. That annual operating cost, since it would be public safety personnel, would be expected to go up in the future as well. So
This is one area where I think we can actively and aggressively look for federal funding. It's got to be out there because illegal drug activity is a problem nationwide, and particularly Arizona being a border state. We should be able to find more federal funding. And I know, Chief, you're very good at bringing us, almost at every council agenda, we approve a grant that you've found. And I hope you can continue to do that.
it's a good point. Okay, I want to be very specific on this particular slide. This information is taken from our current budget, and as the council knows, when a budget is adopted in a fiscal year, and the current budget is fiscal year 15, we have a list of capital projects or capital improvements in that budget year, in this particular example, fiscal year 15. We also have we have a 6-year capital improvement program looking ahead out for an additional 5 years. And so the departments in fiscal year 15 listed out their capital needs for the next 5 years as well. So that's the fiscal year 16 estimate. It is not a recommendation. That column is not a recommendation. that column will undoubtedly have to change and be reduced where it can be reduced because of the budget challenges facing us. But the reason we put these two slides, 36 and 37, in the presentation is that a year ago, when the departments in the general fund were putting together their budgets, they made capital requests. And their capital requests in the approved budget were $1.8 million, and they were anticipating $2.6 million for the following year. So that's $800,000. So if we have a budget challenge, at least in the minds of the departments, if programs continue the way they're going now, which does not mean they have to, or does not mean that we have the money to support them in the way or ways that we do now, this was for the purpose of indicating that there would be some needs out there in addition to the other pension costs and so forth, legislative hits that we've been talking about. The governmental fund vehicle replacement or vehicle replacement fund is of concern, however, because during recent years, in order to balance the budget and keep in business, we have been drawing down this fund considerably. We anticipate that at the end of the current fiscal year, we'll have about $1.6 million balance. At the end of 16, we may have as little as $640,000. To put that in terms of, well, what would that buy? Well, it would buy 10 police cars or 1 fire truck. And that's it. And the fund's gone. The fund balance is gone. This is a matter of concern that we will need to address in the budget process. And this was what's in back of some of those numbers. And again, this is for fiscal year 16. This is not a plan. It is not a recommendation. Things are going to, of necessity, I imagine, look very different. So that's information in the general fund. Mayor Pro Tem, shall we take about a 15-minute break here?
Sure. Do what you need.
Okay.
You all ready? Everybody ready? Okay, let the record reflect we're back in session at 10:30. So, Mayor?
Okay. The Mayor and Council, the second major topic today is streets, which is now the Streets and Open Space Fund. On January 1st of 2016, it will become the Streets Fund with the decrease of the 1% sales tax from 1% to 0.75%. As we know, maintenance and rehabilitation needs are constantly increasing due to the aging conditions of our streets. Some months ago, Public Works Department, George Henderson, gave a very informative presentation about our street inventory, what the condition was and what the implications were in terms of condition and costs for the future. We've included some of the slides from that presentation here, again, for background information, but they're quite informative. As we look into the future, the major capacity or widening projects on our existing arterial streets have pretty much been completed. As we look into the future, and this was known a number of years ago, that we would be shifting over to a pavement preservation and rehabilitation program, and that we would really not have, because of the magnitude of those needs, not have funding to build new streets or augment capacity in future growth areas. And as a matter of policy, certainly in future growth areas, the policy has been that growth pays for growth. So that would be consistent with the policy. Funding from Highway User Revenue Fund, fuel taxes collected and distributed by the states, it's still well below fiscal year 7 collections with the variations in the price of oil. There's been a lot of talk about fuel taxes and things like that. I don't think that we're going to see too much movement on that, at least in the short term, federal or state. The last bullet point on this particular slide is that, as I mentioned, we presently have streets and open space. The sales tax will become streets only, so there will be, going forward, presently, while there is no replacement funding source for open space acquisition, although certainly the general fund can be used for open space acquisition. The problem is that there's no money in the general fund for that purpose, which has presently budgeted, and with the issues that I've outlined at great length, that is problematic.
Mr. Manager, I think it's important to keep a focus on the preservation, understanding the growth limitations because of water, etc., that the anticipated building a bunch of new roads is significantly limited. The problem that we need to address in the budget, in the plenary sessions for strategic plan or specific plan that are not really spelled out in the general plan, when our 1 cent dropped to 3/4 of a cent, it significantly reduced our ability to bond for capital improvement on street projects because we can't justify how we're going to pay the money back to the lender. And I think we need to keep that in focus when we look at, we may have $80 million or $100 million worth of deficit roads, but we don't have the revenue coming in to fix the roads. And I think that's something, as we look at our process here, we need to concentrate on priorities, especially when you look at the road projects and which ones compromise the public safety issues for the consumers in Prescott the most. And if you could address that a little bit as we move forward through this, I'd appreciate that, because I remember our past public works director telling us we couldn't keep up with the road projects with a full 1 cent. We couldn't keep up with the maintenance with a full 1 cent. How are we going to manage with 3/4 of a cent?
And Councilman, I will address that in financial terms, meaning the backlog and what happens to the backlog at different levies of sales tax.
Thank you.
I think we need to consider continuing the open space tax and increasing the street sales tax. You've laid out a really good case here, City Manager, for the fact that the general fund just can't support everything we need to do. The open space component is really important to Prescott. It's important for bringing in tourists, and you told us at the beginning of this presentation that we are sales tax dependent. Tourists spend their dollars here. Prescott has a uniquely beautiful setting where people come on the best maintained trails in the area. They're better than the Forest Service trails because we have a crew of dedicated people who go out there twice a week and really do a good job keeping them clear, level, free of debris. People love them. People spend money here because of them. I think we should refer to the voters another quarter-cent increase, another quarter-cent continuation of the open space sales tax, so that we can continue the open space program that the city started 15 years ago. We've made a really good head start on it. We've got critical pieces that we still need to fill in for connectivity between the two lakes and the entire Dells area. And right now there are two very important pieces of property that are, one would like to converse with us about conservation easements to make a connector between the two lakes. The other is up for sale, and there is the possibility of a conservation easement, trail easements in that large area. We need to have that money available. And going back to the voters and asking them to continue a tax that we already have in place is not a new tax. I think it's something that this community values and we need to have. So at some point, I would like the council to have a discussion about referring sales taxes to the voters. Now, Councilman Lamerson brought up the street sales tax. I think that's also very important, and we should consider increasing that as well to possibly 1.25 cent sales tax increase.
Mr. Mayor?
There's not a motion yet.
Mr. Mayor, if I may, to add on to Councilman Wilcox's statements there, I think we need to go broader than that. I mean, we can go down different avenues, but we shouldn't limit the discussion to tax increase. And I agree that tax increase is important, or a factor, if we want to increase or maintain our roads the way they are. But I would not personally go for a open space, but possibly a public safety fund that would fund our public safety. But on that, I would also look at, you know, there is no sacred cow, whether we contract out for our trash service, fuel mitigation, our vehicle service repairs. Maybe SRP runs our water department. I don't know. We need to look at all options here before we start cutting things. Just some input there.
Well,
Go ahead.
you know, I sat here and listened to our past staff folks recommend a 3/4% sales tax and a reduction of 1/2 cent, which was absolutely crazy. And that was sold to the public, which was wrong, because it puts us in a very precarious position now, being reduced that much. I heard what you said, a full 1% generates, so we just eliminated 1/4% of that. From my standpoint, I don't disagree with buying open space, and I don't necessarily know that there has to be quote unquote a fund for that, because we've always done the right thing on this council, even before we had an open space policy of buying properties on Thumb Butte before there was an open space program. So the council's always been in the direction that open space is important to this community, and I think it will continue that way. The problem that I have is we do not have a mechanism, and I agree with Greg, to fund public safety, period. If we made the case to the public to raise the tax 3/4%, keep the 3/4% for road, to give us flexibility to have a secured funding mechanism for public safety, that would loosen the belt up in the general fund for all these other things that we're talking about doing. So the case to be sold, and I say sold because the public has to be informed and sold on why taxes would go up. And when you can see the numbers of public safety and stuff that we are totally out of control with, based upon state requirements, we are hamstrung because of public safety. And that's just the truth. So if we don't find a mechanism to offset public safety, which the public deserves that, in the fact that when they pick up the phone and have a heart attack, the very best of the best in the city of Prescott are there. The police department's there. If we want to continue those services, then we need to tell the folks in the city of Prescott, you're going to have to pay for it. And how they're going to have to pay for it is by a secured fund. Therefore, it'll loosen up our ability in the general fund at least from my numbers, about $7.5 million, which could do a lot in more road repair, open space purchases, and overall value. It would also give us some flexibility to be able to energize that special enforcement unit of 4 officers and a sergeant to put on the street to clean this damn town up. The public has got to know if we don't have the money, we can't do any of these things. So there's got to be a mechanism. And to have a secured public safety fund, in my opinion, makes the biggest sense.
As you're going forward with preparing a budget for our consideration, I would really encourage you to look at greater efficiencies in providing some of those public safety services. Do we really need new trucks for wildland fire, for example? Things like that. I don't mean to pick on fire, but there are a lot of things there that maybe could be done more efficiently without increasing our cost and therefore the budget.
You know, Mayor, I don't think it's, we keep talking about public safety's thumping us. It's not public safety. It's public safety retirement. It's this broken system that we have no control over that keeps eating our lunch. You know, if we find ways to save $300,000 in the budget, chances are that will get eaten up by that retirement system next year. So I don't know how we get our state delegation to work on this system, all parties involved to work on this system, but really it's, that is the monster in the room. I mean, what was the unfunded liability? $48 million? That's more than we spend for our general fund in a year.
We've been sitting here for 16 years, I have, close to it, waiting for the state to do something. It's time for us to do something. And if the state does fix theirs, then we're going to be the benefactor of that.
But if
we have got to take care of our people today.
And we fund that, we will take care of them just for today. We need to take care of this for the guys just starting right now, so in 20 years they have something to get. It doesn't look like this is sustainable moving forward. And when you say, okay, we have this pie chart and public safety is growing and you got to take it out of other slices of the pie, okay, you get rid of Parks and Rec, you get rid of the library, get rid of anything. That doesn't solve the problem. That box is going to continue to close no matter how much we save. We could wipe out everything else. If it keeps growing at the rate that it's growing, we're in a serious trouble.
Then maybe what you do is you get the state to say, that, or the city to say, every time they give us a public safety increase, we pass it on to the fire department and reduce their budget by the amount that they raised it. In other words, the fire department's the one that's going to suffer. In this point in time, with the people that are down there mismanaging their retirement fund, and that's what it is from the state level. That's not our fault, but it's shoving down our throat, coming from an inadequate system at the state level, and they haven't changed it in 16 years since I've been around, and I don't look for them to change it in another 16. Nobody down there has the cojones to do it, but this council's got to have the cojones to protect our people.
Craig, we got 25 pages to go.
I can go quickly.
Did you order lunch in? I think all of these things, and that's the purpose of this meeting today, is to bring some things out so we can have a conversation. Piggybacking on what Gene has said about open space, it's important. I think the acquisition policy was flawed from day one. We've spent $16 million in open space acquisition since this fund started, and I don't know how many of those dollars that there's actually productive space in our portfolio. And to me, that's what needs to be looked at, is it's more than spending money, it's buying property that will fit into our overall scheme of things, that will ultimately produce a return in the way of people coming to use those properties. So I think an inventory of what we've already spent, and maybe we have some land that doesn't fit into our portfolio today. And we need to take a look at the whole policy, not just increasing taxes or buying land for the sake of buying land. We bought some very expensive land that's still laying in a raw form that is very difficult to walk over, much less build a trail over. So it's part of the big problem. And I think that this council now needs to take a look at the overall. And if there's fixes, and it's going to take more taxes for those fixes, we've got to decide what they are. And what would be along something that that will go along with inflation, because doing a fix for 1 year just creates another problem next year. So hopefully, as we go through this program, we'll come with some solutions. Jim?
Well, thank you, Mayor. I appreciate my fellow council's perspective on various different things. Every 2 years, the public of the city of Prescott has an opportunity to send people here to be stewards of their money, their assets, etc. And a few years back, there was a proposal to extend the 1 cent street and open space fund to the year 2040. And there was an option also to reduce it to 3/4 cent. And I agree with Blair that we had folks on city staff at the time that pushed that reduction, and that has compromised not only the city's ability to maintain our streets, to bond to help capital improvements for our streets, it also crippled the opportunity for future councils to preserve such open space as they choose to preserve for sitting councils at the time. I mean, it was a limiting factor. When the initial streets and open space initiative was presented to the public, it was subsequently capped under the term of, I think it was Mayor Steiger at the time, to a specific number. And the fact of the matter is, through this whole process, various councils, various council makeups have tried to concentrate on the priorities that were necessary for public health and safety in the city, with streets taking a priority over other things. I agree that we need to have a dedicated revenue stream so that every year we're not sitting here, or a council's not sitting here, trying to go through this juggling act of how do we balance our situation with our public safety funds. We need to have a fund very similar in effect to what the street fund was or the sewer fund is. And now I know statutorily we can't charge people for police and fire calls, etc., but we can look at other things. I do know that repeatedly, year after year, our fire department has told us, or has expressed to us, that the majority of their time is not spent fighting fires. The majority, and if I'm not mistaken, when I sat through some testimonies during some situations here with the Fire Board of Appeals, I heard that the majority of the folks that we have in the fire department, as we live, breathe, and speak today, are qualified wildland firefighters. So we shouldn't be out there looking for privatizing anything or giving the responsibility over this community's fire safety to somebody in the private sector. We are already paying for that service. We've got people right on staff qualified to do that job. And if this community's not safe, that's an area that you can look at, is reducing costs with regards to not going out buying somebody else to do a job that we've already got employees on staff that are fully qualified to do. That's part of what the manager needs to hear in order to present us a budget that is palatable for the 7 people that are going to make the policies. Here's how we choose to go forward. So I'm not opposed to presenting to the public. We may need more money, but first let's research all our options.
Yeah, Mayor, I just wanted to kind of clarify when I was responding with Steve. Just what I've seen today and what I've seen from being on council is over the last 7 years, our ongoing liability has increased $4.5 million. So we're going to have a dedicated half cent going to public safety. That'll raise you about $6 million. So that means in about 8 years or 2 council terms, whoever's sitting up here is going to have the same problem that we have today. Until we fix the problem, we're never going to solve it by increased taxation. So I think we're saying the same thing, Steve, but
Well,
I just wanted to clarify on that.
there's got to be a lifeline somewhere. If we do nothing, then we could shut the library down and shut Parks and Recreation down and say we just found our $8 million to pay for the mismanagement of public safety fund. But what are we going to do?
I guess what I'm just saying, I'd rather have a stitch than a Band-Aid, and I don't know how we get the stitch.
Well, we got people that are from this area down there, and very, very evident that Phoenix has taken the union to task on their public safety program and got shot down by the voters, and the people aren't willing to stand up. So it's going to be like this for quite some time. It's just it is absolutely bankrupting every community in the country. It's unattainable. So I don't know how you fix it, but here in the city of Prescott, we need to make the case to the public that we have to take care of our people.
I think we're on page 42.
Yeah, and we'll be quite a few beyond that in just a minute here. For reference purposes, I've included information on the pavement management program. Again, looking at our street infrastructure, the condition of the infrastructure, and if we're not careful with our street infrastructure, if we neglect it, if we underfund it, then the deterioration will, in 10 years or so, the accumulated amount or value of that depreciation, that deterioration will be double what the shortfall is in our public safety personnel retirement system pension. So this is very important as well. If we let our streets go, it's going to be multiples of what the issue is in public safety fund.
Yep.
And again, all this is on the presentation, which will be available on the website, which provides background information about how you manage a pavement preservation program. And the numbers in those previous slides we'll get back to in a minute as we lay out some scenarios. We will be refining this series of slides for the budget process, so we have more detail and specificity for streets and open space fund or streets fund in fiscal year 16. Where does the money go? How much revenue is there? And of course, it's 1 cent plus fuel tax, HERF. Where does the money go? We will be refining this, but here's the pie chart for the streets fund. In there, you see debt service for very large capital projects that we've done in the past. Street operations, this is for, patching potholes, for street sweeping, for removing flood damage and debris from rights-of-way and so forth. Field and facilities operations, engineering operations. This depicts what happens when you reduce when the sales tax, the 1% sales tax is reduced from 1% to 3/4%. That green part is the part of the pie that will be missing on January 1st of 2016, which gives you an indication that we have some issues. If our backlog in pavement preservation is substantial, it will get nothing but worse very quickly. And finally, the city does not yet have a fully implemented asset management system for our buildings. This means that we have none of the figures that we have showed you in previous budgets have identified the maintenance and rehabilitation backlog nor funded it. So what are the long-term needs for the Grace Sparks Recreation Center, for City Hall, for these other buildings in the general fund? For our public safety facilities, for the police building, for all of our fire stations. We have not identified that maintenance and rehabilitation backlog and put them on a preventive maintenance program which is funded. So that is yet another unfunded amount and liability, future liability for the general fund. Okay, so we've laid out the news, and there's not a lot of good news in terms of finances for the general fund or the streets fund. So what are some potential scenarios? Well, as we know, where we usually end up is in a mixture of actions. That is, sure, there can be a sales tax initiative, but there are also expectations of doing things or potentially doing things differently, of becoming more efficient, of looking for opportunities with our regional partners and so forth. So it's not just, how much more money do you need. We have that ongoing process of becoming more effective and more efficient. All the things that we've done, continuing to do well in the future. I did want to make a few points, and I call it plain talk about both of these funds. If we think that the financial shape is going to improve dramatically to meet our short and long-term dramatic needs, which are increasing, by hoping that the economy recovers, we're kidding ourselves. And the reason for that is because of the revenue structure of municipalities. the national economy, the state economy could boom, but because of the very few revenue sources which accrue to, run our budget, we're not going to see substantial increases like that. Our costs basically are outstripping the growth in our revenues. As I mentioned, we have taken actions and we will continue to take actions to become more strategic and efficient. Eliminating waste, cutting bureaucracy, or putting somebody else in charge, unquote. I mean, you see this in the media all the time. That's not going to generate dollars. We're talking about significant dollars that we have no control over, and none of those are going to solve the problems that we've laid out today. As we have said, that with that competition and the tension in the general fund, maintaining essential public safety services at the levels desired and that our residents expect, while maintaining the quality of other services we enjoy, that's problematic. So with respect to specifically the streets fund, we've laid out 3 scenarios. The first scenario is, as we know, the 1% sales tax goes to 3/4 cent on January 1st of 2016. That 1% generates presently about $13 million a year. If that 1% was preserved instead of being reduced to 9.75 estimated revenue, even so, with the restoration to the 1 cent, or the continuation of the 1 cent, depending on how you want to look at that, 10 years from now, the backlog of pavement maintenance and rehabilitation needs would have grown from $72 to $79 million. So our current 1% funding, if solely dedicated to streets, is not going to result in an overall improvement in our street system. The unfunded backlog will continue to grow, streets will deteriorate. Scenario number 2, figure of 1.25% has been thrown out this morning. What might that do? Well, within 10 years, by 2026 again, an increase to 1.25% would reduce the backlog of pavement, maintenance, and rehabilitation needs from $72 to $46 million. So that gives you an indication that we would be chipping away at our maintenance backlog, but it would not be waving the wand and doing away with it even in 10 years. But this is positive. It's dealing with the issue. It's making progress in reducing our maintenance and rehabilitation needs. For streets, the doomsday scenario is number 3, do nothing. Take no action, do nothing. The sales tax for streets decreases to 0.75% effective January 1st of 2016. 10 years after that, the backlog of pavement maintenance and rehabilitation needs would have grown from $72 to $98 million, which is twice the whole situation in the public safety liability, and keep growing after that. Of necessity, I would suggest, priority would have to be given to the major thoroughfares. That's where most of the traffic is, arterials and collectors, to prevent widespread deterioration in the condition and value of our street assets. We all remember what Iron Springs Road looked like before it was reconstructed. It was terrible. If we don't deal with streets, it is a certainty that we will have other arterials looking like Iron Springs Road. And if the focus, even so, underfunding this backlog, even underfunding that, and with the emphasis on the major thoroughfares, street pavement will rapidly deteriorate in the residential areas, and our residents will be very unhappy about that.
Mr. Mayor, it'd be nice to see, if we know what the average spending for someone in Prescott is, what an impact of 0.25 would be to their pocketbook. I mean, when you talk about people spending, is that an extra $25 a year? Is that an extra $100 a year? What would, if we increase that? I think it's really easy when you're driving on fairly decent roads to say, well, we don't really need to increase any kind of funding to that. But what we've been shows us that if we let this drop to 3/4 of a cent, we're going to have some serious problems in 10 years. So it would be nice to see what the impact would be to your average person and have that going forward so we know what the impact is in real dollars.
We can do that. Yeah. Then moving on to the general fund, we've also identified, just for discussion presentation purposes, 3 scenarios. Common to the general fund scenarios are a couple of bullet points here, and there, of course, we could make many more, but just to simplify, that in any event, we will continue to explore additional opportunities for operational and financial efficiencies with our primary regional public safety partners. In the city of Prescott, for example, we have mutual aid agreement. Sometimes we have fire apparatus out of service and training or so forth. We have an agreement with Central Yavapai, and it works in both directions and so forth. There may be some additional opportunities there for operational and financial efficiencies. That's an example. With respect to fire service, it really boils down to exploring variations of all risk models, which may include, as I mentioned, expanded partnerships or separate provision of fire service functions. So, yes, we do have a fire department. Yes, we do have firefighters. They have fire trucks. And their business really consists of 2 main things presently. The first thing is fire suppression, but multiples of fire suppression calls are emergency medical calls. And, we did commission the ICMA study. The fire department is working through that. And before we go down a path where we dramatically change things about how we respond, the fire department, as our experts, needs to tell us, well, respond to what? Respond to what type of critical events, which then drive manpower and equipment, and what that means in terms of our relationship with our regional partners, and what that ultimately boils down to in terms of service provided to the public, to our customers, and levels of service. And so we need to work through all those things so that when somebody says, okay, you're responding 5 minutes now, you just went through an elaborate scenario and said how you're going to do things differently. What's that mean to me if I have a medical emergency at my house? What's that 5 minutes going to compare to? And so that's the type of analysis that absolutely has to be done and communicated so we really know what we're doing when we change response models or ways that we respond. So the 3 scenarios, for example, and this is the title on this is a public safety sales tax. Simpler the better. As has been pointed out, what it would do is reduce tension in the general fund. Suppose it was 1% and it was effective on January 1st of 2016. We know that 1% generates about $13 million. What would that mean? Well, we would maintain the current high level of public safety services while still exploring these alternative response models. We would be able to maintain non-core quality of life services and amenities, libraries, parks, and so forth. At least for some foreseeable future, we would be able to absorb or better absorb future public safety retirement system increases. Yes, it would not really solve what's driving that whole machine, that money machine, but we would stay in business. We'd be able to reduce our unfunded liabilities somewhat. We would be able to comprehensively implement selected classification and compensation study recommendations that we don't even have yet to remain a competitive public sector employer. That was mentioned by a council member. Funding source for airport development, timely replacement of public safety vehicles and equipment that we need for these revised service models if they're different. Maintain our buildings and still have reserves in the general fund. Scenario 2, enact a half-cent public safety sales tax. Not the financial benefit, obviously. It would only be half the money, $6.5 million of scenario 1, but certainly buying time to stay in business in the general fund. Scenario 3, take no action regarding a public safety sales tax, not good news. Eventual reduction of public safety services, after the non-core essential services, the services that provide quality of life for us, after they've been further whittled away or eliminated, if we still see dramatic increases in public safety costs, eventually they're going to have to be cut back. Public safety. That would not be anything unprecedented in this country. There are a lot of places, a lot of cities, a lot of fire districts that have browned out stations, and they're not coming back for a long time. We don't want to have to do that. Of extreme concern is the second bullet point. We want to avoid at all costs a downward spiral wherein Prescott becomes less attractive or unattractive to tourists, to visitors. And why would that be? Well, it's because we're not maintaining our quality of life attractors. What happens then? Well, if people don't come, they don't spend money. That means less general fund revenue. That means further cuts to non-core quality of life services and amenities. That's a downward spiral. Property values decrease. It's not a good situation. In terms of financing, the city can incur debt for major capital items, but we need to do that very selectively. We're not going to solve the funding challenges in the general fund without additional revenue. We're not going to solve that by diverting a substantial portion of resources to go into debt to pay for stuff. You don't go into debt for operational reasons, to pay for operational costs, because you will never catch up. We will have no progress in reducing or eliminating our unfunded liabilities in public safety. They'll keep sending us bills. We're going to have to keep paying, but we're not going to make any progress. And there will become a tipping point at which time, again, as I mentioned, if you only have so much money, you can only provide so much service. If the money is going to pension systems instead of providing services, the services can't be provided anymore. Deteriorating public buildings and facilities, lack of funding for airport development, and uncompetitive and public employment market. I'm describing a scenario here where someone comes into City Hall. In the old days, they used to see a receptionist, they used to talk to somebody, they used to get immediate service. I'm describing a scenario where City Hall isn't as well maintained as it used to be, where you push a button or you make an appointment to talk to somebody and people are going like this because there's no money to fix the problem that we're all talking about 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago. This is all predictable stuff here. If a ballot question was to be considered, this is pretty much the information that was provided the other day for the general plan. There are some time frames that have to be met. These are strictly for information. Your staff is not recommending scenario 1, 2, or 3 for streets or the general fund. We're simply putting information on the table for a series of workshops to follow, for us to respond to the comments that you've made today and any other comments that you'd like to offer now. We've included, it's really a scorecard or checklist of specific general fund budget items that we're going to have to work through as we formulate the fiscal year 16 budget, which will extend over the next couple of months, hopefully culminating in June in the adoption of the final budget. So at this time, if council members have any other specific items or you'd like us to look at in preparation for our next discussion, we've written down some of those, or if you have any additional comments, certainly this would be an appropriate time.
Craig, I have one. The general plan, we're going to be moving along concurrently with it. What do you see that's in the general plan as it will be presented to the council that might affect the way we look at budget?
Well, if it depends on the final language of the general plan. If the general plan, and of course the general plan is just that. It's more of expression of interest and vision than, as Councilman Lamerson has mentioned, it's not a strategic plan. It doesn't say exactly what you're going to do with what you've got. It's more of a vision. But if the general plan says that we want to do a lot of things which have a lot of financial implications and we don't have the money to do it, then there's not a whole lot of value in having a general plan that's as extensive as that. It may need to be more general. We'd like to be a great community, but if we don't have the money to do that, you know, what's the point? So I don't think that the general plan itself will drive a lot of budget or financial decisions. But certainly, I think as the council goes through the general plan, we should be attuned to that aspect of anything in there which would lead the public to believe that, yes, this is going to be done, and it costs money, knowing that it costs money, but on the other hand, knowing that we're challenged to provide that money.
Well, I think where that leads us is that the people that worked 2 years on the general plan, the one thing they didn't have to use is some of the things we're looking at in the way of budget. So if budget constraints are going to affect the general plan, then which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Jim, you can answer that.
Well, a general plan, as the manager pointed out, is exactly that. It's a general plan. It's not a strategic plan. And they're two different things. And the general plan committee was made up of volunteer members, of which council appointed. And here's the vision. It was vetted through your planning and zoning to see what constraints there may be with regards to the zoning that we have in place, some of the governmental comments that needed to be made during that process, and then it comes to us. And when it comes to the city council, we're the ones at the bottom line that say, here's what we're going to present to the public in a general plan. Now, that general plan may say, yeah, we want to be a nice community. We want first quality services. We want to be someplace that people want to come and visit. That's a general plan. A strategic plan, which we really need to get off the dime and start designing, says how we're going to get there. How are we going to get to where we anticipate generally how we're going to go? If you want to have a first-class police and fire, you want to make sure that you don't have some of what's been going on the streets. The strategic plan may include what the manager needs with regard to, yeah, we need to increase the presence of our whatever force you want to call it, that's been enabled with equipment and personnel to do what we're asking them to do. You could say the same thing with your water, your sewer, your roads, your fire, and your police. That's what you do. Then you have a strategic plan, hand to him, and it's his job to figure out how to implement it. It's his job to keep us out of court. That's how that works.
But then the strategic plan has got to be at least thought about
Absolutely.
as we approach the general plan.
The strategic plan needs to be approached as you approach your budget.
Okay.
Here's how we're going to pay for it. Here's what we as a council, from a policy perspective, want to have implemented. And if you don't have any general idea of how you're going to generate the revenue, how can we give him a list of what we want done with no idea how he's going to pay for it?
I think you understand it. Steve?
Well, thank you, Craig, for your presentation. I don't see any of this working without that 1% secured mechanism for public safety personally. I know we've been through a lot of budget scenarios over the years I've been here. Can you tell me at your fingertips how many employees we have downsized since 2006, roughly? Because the public always wants to know, what have you done to bolster your own cause to ask us for a tax increase? And I think the city of Prescott's done a lot of things.
Yeah. It's about 65.
Okay, so we're down 65 employees. I would ask, the only thing that I can see that we might look at doing is there room within asking each department to reduce their operating budgets by 5%, which would generate roughly $8 million based upon, based upon the number of budget we had this year.
Well, we can always do that. The way, frankly, I think the preferable way to do it is look at outcomes. What do we want to accomplish? So, and we've been doing that constantly in recent years.
And that's what I wanted to hear, because again, the public needs to understand that we have done that.
Yeah.
The only thing I see that we haven't done, and I continue to harp on it, is to have, I have a map in my office of properties the city of Prescott is holding of outside the city limits of the city of Prescott. I would ask that we look at those properties to evaluate whether they need to be reserved for any particular reason or eliminated and sold, and that money to be put back into our capital projects in the city of Prescott, where it might need to be used for a building, where it might need to be used for a fire station, one-time expenses. I don't see us sitting on property that we, over the years that Prescott's been incorporated, have gathered and we are not in control of or having any use for. Why don't we evaluate them, put them on the market, and bring the money back here where it'll help this community?
Councilman Blair, I'll just remind you, because sometimes we get involved in a lot of discussions and we forget certain things and everything. The properties that, a lot of them that we've bought and paid for had to do with water acquisition, and water acquisition funds were used for the purchase. And when we sell those properties, because they were out of dedicated funds, those revenues have to go back into that fund. You can't just take that money and do anything you choose to with it. So if you don't have any specific capital improvements that have to do with water fund or sewer fund or trash fund or whatever the case would be, you can't just sell those things to try and bolster something else. Mr. Manager, am I correct on that?
That's right.
Well, yes. On the other hand, to Councilman Blair's point, if, for example, the Watson Lake water quality remediation project, which we haven't really estimated, that required some capital investment, that would be a source for using, the proceeds from property sale.
Well, I think we're sitting here talking about a budget, and I think we're sitting here looking at all the different ways we can generate revenues based upon how they're going to be spent, whether they're one time for remediation of Watson and Willow Lake. That's certainly better than having it sit out in Chino Valley at no use whatsoever to this community. That reduces one liability to the general fund. So whatever, the point I'm trying to make is to do an evaluation of all those properties. And I know, like Willow Creek Park was a park that we can't sell, but we can repurpose that park and use it for something else. So I'm just saying, let's start looking at those things and seeing if they can help our budget situation.
I don't disagree with that side of the argument. I'm just reminding you that the dollars have to be appropriated correctly. We can't just go generate a lot of dollars without a plan.
If we have 600 acres in Chino Valley that we can sell fair market value, I'd certainly rather have that money to take care of our problems at Watson and Willow Lake instead of having it come out of the general fund.
That's part of your strategic plan. That's my
And
point.
that's what I'm saying. That's what we need to look at. And we've bypassed it every single year. At some point in time, it needs to happen. And I know, again, it takes staff to do that, Mr. McConnell. I do know that. But I think we're remiss if we don't start looking at those things.
Charlie, you've sat here and written a manuscript. You've got 30 minutes.
Mayor, thank you. I'm just taking it all in and listening to everybody's comments. And my one question I do have for the manager is, when is our next anticipated workshop going to be?
March 10th, Councilman, and I will be providing a tentative list to the council today of the workshops for March, April, and so forth for the budget and also the general plan. We've been doing some thinking about those as well.
Mayor, would it be possible at I want to get the date correct, to February 24th, depending on how busy that agenda is, that we add an agenda item, general discussion related to the budget, so that if items come up that we as a council need to be able to discuss and give feedback to staff, we can do it as a group, do it in open and do it legally?
You could certainly
He said
add,
legally.
well, You could certainly add
No.
a sort of workshop item, I guess, to the regular, the February, the next February meeting is a voting meeting. Or you could have a separate workshop starting at 1 o'clock or sometime in the morning on that day. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know how busy that agenda is as far as voting goes. But it's a voting session. You'd have to add it as a special workshop, either to the 3 o'clock or have a separate.
Council, what you're going to find when Craig gives you the proposed schedule is that since generally everybody dedicates Tuesday, most of the day, to events here at City Hall, that we'll be scheduling workshops in the morning and then going ahead and having our regular meeting in the afternoon. And I suppose if we could anticipate in some of those workshops that it would need to be an action item, we could go ahead and agenda it as a possible action item and go ahead and move on it that same day. So it's just we'll have to work our way through it.
Absolutely. Well, and Mayor, you indicated I've written quite a list, and instead of going through this list today, there are several items that have follow-up questions that I need to ask before I just go and make a blanket statement about something. And so if the opportunity presents itself, my preference would be to have that flexibility in every meeting that we have coming up to bring up agenda item or bring up budget items for discussion. And Steve, to your earlier point, because of the way the schedule's set up and open meeting laws and what we've been discovering about our ability to share ideas or not, really the only opportunity to give direction to staff for inclusion in the budget is going to be through an open council discussion saying, here's an area that we have a question or an interest, this is some direction to staff related to it. So if that's possible, I'd like to go down that road, please.
I think it's a good idea. Do you see any problem there, Craig?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Mayor, I'd like to note that April 14th is the deadline for calling for an election. That's only 2 months away. So if there's any serious thought about putting sales taxes on the ballot, we need several meetings, 1 or 2 at least, devoted to discussion of which sales tax, how much, and I would really like to hear from the public on those issues too.
Well, realizing this is also an election year,
Not for me.
whether you want to be
You can throw me under the bus.
there might be consideration of whether this type of a tax increase would be appropriate on the August or the November election. So,
Right, okay.
it's not going to be pretty. So, any other comment? What, we lose Greg?
Yeah, a while ago.
Okay. Anything else here? Okay. Anything you want to throw out before we?
No, we'll talk about putting an item on the agenda, which will provide an opportunity, different agendas, which provide an opportunity or venue for items to be brought up, not having to wait a month or whatever it is.
I think that could be very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Like I said, there's just so many items that we need to ask staff questions about, do independent research on, and then come back and have a discussion.
Mayor, I would suggest to you with your last comment, regardless if it's an election year or not, we have to be open and honest with our residents and our taxpayers with regards to some of the situations we are dealing with. And the fact of the matter is, the sooner we deal with them, the better off that our resident taxpayers are going to be. We can't keep running and hiding simply because it's an election. If the fact of the matter is we need revenue to take care of some of these things, let's be honest and tell them, here's the situation we're in, here's the proposals that we have, you either want them or you don't.
Yeah, and here's a general plan you all want, but we don't have any way to fund anything in the general plan unless we pass it.
Well, I think we agree. The August would be the appropriate time, and it gives us a little more time if the effective date is January 1st of 16.
Yeah.
It gives us a little room to know what we're going to do. So,
Thank you.
okay. Mr. Paladini, any words of wisdom? Okay.
He is wisdom.
Everybody have a good morning.
I'm the Pali Lama.
We're adjourned.